Have you ever watched someone lose everything because they judged the wrong person on what should have been an ordinary first-class flight? A flight attendant looked at one quiet black woman and decided she didn't belong. Seconds later, in front of an entire cabin, she slapped the woman's hand away and accused her of lying. Passengers stared. Phones started recording. Everyone expected the woman to fight back, but she never raised her voice. What nobody on that aircraft knew was that the woman they were humiliating wasn't just another passenger. Within minutes, a single name on her boarding pass would bring airline executives rushing onto the plane, leave the crew speechless, and turn one act of prejudice into a lesson the entire country would never forget. Stay with us, because what happened next is more unbelievable than anyone on that flight could have imagined. The sound echoed through the first-class cabin so sharply that every conversation stopped at once. Heads turned, glasses froze halfway to waiting hands. Even the flight crew standing farther down the aisle lit up in disbelief. A quiet black woman remained seated beside the window, her expression calm despite the flight attendant having just slapped her hand away as she tried to present her boarding pass. "I already told you," the flight attendant snapped loudly, enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You don't belong in first class. Please stop making this more difficult." The woman slowly lowered her hand without a trace of anger. Her tailored navy jacket was elegant but understated, and there was nothing flashy about the simple leather bag resting beside her seat. She looked like someone who valued dignity over attention. "I believe this is my assigned seat," she replied softly. "If you'll just look at my boarding pass, I'm sure we can clear this up." The attendant barely glanced at the ticket before pushing it aside. "I don't need to see it," she said with growing impatience. "I've worked this cabin 4 years. I know who belongs here." Whispers rippled across the luxurious cabin. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others assumed the attendant must know something they didn't. One businessman quietly shook his head, convinced the woman had wandered into the wrong section. Another passenger frowned, sensing that something about the confrontation didn't feel right. Still, the woman refused to raise her voice. She simply folded her boarding pass carefully and rested it on her lap, meeting the attendant's glare with remarkable composure. That unexpected calm only seemed to make the attendant more irritated. "If you don't leave this seat immediately," she warned, "I'll have security remove you before this plane ever leaves the gate." Not once did the woman flinch. Not once did she argue. She simply looked out the window for a brief moment, before returning her eyes to the flight attendant with quiet confidence. But what the flight attendant didn't know was that this quiet passenger wasn't just another traveler. And within minutes, everyone on that aircraft would wish they had paid closer attention. The flight attendant took a sharp step backward and motioned toward another member of the cabin crew. "Come over here," she called. "We have a passenger refusing to follow instructions." Within seconds, another attendant arrived. Without asking a single question, she stood beside her colleague, her crossed arms making it clear which side she had already chosen. The whispers around first class grew louder. What did she do? Is she in the wrong seat? I knew something looked off. Several passengers quietly pulled out their phones beneath the armrests, recording without drawing attention. Others watched with uneasy expressions, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something far more disturbing. A businessman in the front row leaned toward his wife and muttered, "People try this all the time. They hope nobody notices until the doors close." Across the aisle, an older woman frowned. "Or maybe," she replied firmly, "they're refusing to notice the truth." The calm passenger remained exactly where she was. She reached for her boarding pass once again and held it out with steady hands. "My seat assignment is here," she said gently. "Please verify it before making another assumption." The first attendant refused even to look. "I've already made my decision." Moments later, the captain was informed that a disruptive passenger was delaying departure. Without speaking to the woman personally, the message returned from the cockpit. "Support the cabin crew. Keep the passenger off the flight, if necessary." The decision spread through the cabin almost instantly. making the atmosphere even heavier. Yet the woman never argued. She never raised her voice. Instead, she folded her hands neatly in her lap, breathing slowly as if the noise around her belonged to someone else's story. Years earlier, as a young girl, her grandmother had taught her a lesson she never forgot. People can take your comfort, she used to say. They can insult your appearance. They can question your worth. But the moment they control your character, you have handed them your greatest treasure. Those words had carried her through poverty, discrimination, and countless closed doors. She had learned that anger often gives prejudice exactly what it expects. Dignity, however, forces people to confront themselves. That lesson echoed in her mind as another accusation landed. If you continue resisting, the attendant warned, airport security will escort you out. Still, the woman simply nodded. I understand your position, she answered quietly, but I also know my rights, and I will remain in the seat listed on my boarding pass. The cabin fell into another uneasy silence. The confidence in her voice wasn't defiance. It was certainty. Then, just as another crew member reached for the boarding pass, someone noticed a single detail printed near the top of the ticket. And everything began to change. As another crew member reached for the boarding pass, she hesitated for just a moment before looking down carefully instead of brushing it aside. Her eyes narrowed. There, printed discreetly near the top corner, was a confidential designation reserved for only a handful of passengers each year. It wasn't something most flight attendants ever encountered, and company policy required immediate verification before any action could be taken. She looked again. Then her gaze stopped on the woman's last name. It sounded strangely familiar. Without saying another word, the senior crew member stepped into the galley and made a hurried call to the captain. I think you need to see this, she whispered. Within seconds, the captain was holding the boarding pass in his hands. The confidence that had filled his face moments earlier disappeared as he studied the details twice, then a third time, before anyone could ask a question. The cockpit phone rang. It wasn't another member of the cabin crew. It was airline headquarters. The captain answered, listening silently as the voice on the other end spoke with unmistakable urgency. His expression changed completely. Understood, he replied quietly. We'll delay departure. The call ended, but another began almost immediately. Ground operations, then airport management, then corporate security. The chain of communication moved through the airline with astonishing speed. Back in first class, passengers noticed the sudden shift. The attendants who had spoken so confidently only moments before were now whispering among themselves. Their faces had lost every trace of certainty. The flight attendant who had started the confrontation swallowed hard. What's happening? She asked, forcing a nervous smile. No one answered. Outside the aircraft windows, an airport vehicle pulled alongside the jet bridge. A sharply dressed corporate executive stepped out and hurried toward the entrance, carrying no luggage, only a company identification badge. The cabin door opened. Without acknowledging anyone else, he walked directly down the aisle until he reached the quiet woman. To the astonishment of every passenger, he stopped beside her seat. Then he smiled warmly. Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks, he said with genuine respect. I sincerely apologize for the delay. We didn't realize you were already on board. The cabin froze. Not a whisper, not a movement. The executive turned toward the stunned crew. I believe introductions are overdue, he said calmly. This is Ms. Evelyn Brooks, the majority owner and chairwoman of this airline. A wave of shocked gasps swept through first class. Phones that had been recording lowered in disbelief. The businessman who had assumed she didn't belong stared speechless at the floor. The older woman simply nodded, as though the truth had finally caught up with everyone's assumptions. The flight attendant's face turned completely pale. The boarding pass slipped from her trembling fingers. In a matter of seconds, every harsh word she had spoken came rushing back with painful clarity. She hadn't embarrassed an ordinary passenger. She had humiliated the very woman responsible for the airline's future, and the person who had chosen to travel anonymously. to see how customers were truly treated when no one believed they were. Important. Everyone expected anger. Everyone expected revenge. But what happened next stunned the crew even more than her true identity ever could. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the corporate executive turned toward airport security. "Please remain here," he said firmly. "We'll need to escort the flight attendant off the aircraft while we begin an internal investigation." The attendant's composure vanished. Her shoulders trembled, and tears streamed down her face as the reality of the moment settled in. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I made a terrible mistake. Please, I never meant for this to happen." She looked directly at Miss Brooks. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I'm deeply sorry." Every passenger waited for the response they thought was inevitable. A public dismissal, a harsh lecture, a moment of humiliation matching the one she had just endured. Instead, Miss Brooks slowly rose from her seat. She glanced around the cabin before speaking in the same calm voice she had maintained from the beginning. "Everyone, please sit down." No one moved. Even the executives stopped where they stood. She turned toward the frightened flight attendant. "If leadership is used to embarrass people," she said gently, "then it becomes another form of power without purpose." The attendant lowered her head, unable to meet her eyes. "This isn't only about one person's decision," Miss Brooks continued. "It's about a culture that quietly teaches people to judge confidence by clothing, dignity by appearance, and belonging by assumptions." Her words settled over the cabin, a complete stillness. "If one employee feels comfortable making those assumptions," she added, "then I must ask what we've failed to teach as an organization." She looked at the executive. "I don't want an example made of her." The executive blinked in surprise. "I want an honest investigation into how we train every member of this airline, review our customer service policies, review our leadership standards. If this happened today, we have work to do." A few crew members lowered their heads, reflecting on moments they had never questioned before. Others quietly wiped away tears. The flight attendant could barely speak. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll spend the rest of my career earning the forgiveness I don't deserve." Around the cabin, passengers began clapping. One pair of hands became 10. Became 20. Soon, the entire first-class cabin echoed with heartfelt applause, not for wealth or authority, but for grace under pressure. Meanwhile, the videos quietly recorded by passengers were already being uploaded. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching a woman who had answered prejudice not with anger, but with extraordinary dignity. The flight had finally begun, yet the journey that truly mattered was only taking off. Within 24 hours, the entire country was talking about a single flight and one unforgettable lesson. By the following morning, the story had spread far beyond the airport terminal. Television networks replayed the cabin footage. News websites analyzed every moment. Millions of viewers watched the quiet exchange that had exposed how quickly appearances could shape assumptions and how power could be exercised with compassion instead of humiliation. The conversation reached every corner of the country. Former airline employees stepped forward to share stories of passengers who had been judged because of their race, clothing, age, or accent. Many admitted they had witnessed similar moments, but had never spoken up. Others praised the courage of those who had recorded the incident, believing accountability begins when people refuse to look away. Faced with overwhelming public attention, the airline announced sweeping reforms. Customer service policies were reviewed from top to bottom. New training programs emphasized fairness, empathy, and the importance of treating every traveler with equal respect, regardless of appearance or background. The flight attendant also chose not to disappear from public view. In a heartfelt statement, she accepted full responsibility for her actions. She acknowledged that her assumptions had caused unnecessary harm and expressed gratitude for the opportunity to learn rather than simply be condemned. Her apology sparked conversations about personal accountability, reminding people that meaningful change begins with honest reflection. Days later, Ms. Evelyn Brooks addressed employees from every department during a company-wide meeting. She stood before thousands without mentioning her own experience until the very end. "Our uniforms represent this airline," she said, "but our character represents something far greater. Respect should never depend on race, clothing, wealth, status, or the seat someone occupies. Every passenger deserves to feel seen, valued, and welcomed from the moment they step aboard." Her words became the foundation of a renewed commitment to dignity and fairness throughout the company. In the months that followed, passenger confidence steadily grew. As for Ms. Brooks, she quietly returned to her daily responsibilities, declining interviews and avoiding the spotlight. She had never boarded that flight seeking recognition. She had simply wanted to understand the experience of an ordinary traveler. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. True greatness rarely announces itself with titles, luxury, or applause. It reveals itself through humility, courage, and the quiet strength to answer prejudice with grace. The flight attendant believed she was judging an ordinary passenger, but that day, the person she underestimated wasn't defined by the seat she occupied, it was by the character she carried. Because true greatness never demands recognition, it simply reveals itself when the moment matters most.